Good morning. Happy Friday. So today, before we get started, we're going to review chapter 13 and the beginning of 14 just to remind you where we left off. And then we are going to continue reading the rest of 13 and all of 14 for today's assignment. Sorry, I got confused there for a second. Um, First off, if you are reading from a copy that looks like this, I know some of you got these copies sent home. We will be picking up today on page 101. So if you're in this book and you're reading from a copy like this, then we're on page 101. That's where we're continuing from. If you're reading off the PDF, I obviously have it pulled up. You'll just have to kind of look for this spot as we continue to read today. So yesterday in chapter 12, Jonas has trained with the giver a little bit, and we know that it is the old man is called the giver. We found that out at the end of chapter 11. So he's the giver of memories. Jonas is the receiver of memories. In chapter 12, he kind of fibs to his mom a little bit, and he has this repeated dream about the sled. But he's not allowed to talk about his training, and he's not allowed to participate in telling his dreams. So he just kind of says, oh yeah, I slept fine. And then as we continue into chapter 12, he realizes as he's going to work that day, to the training with the giver, that he thinks he sees something weird again when he looks at Fiona, and he goes in and he talks to the giver about it, and the giver says, oh, I think I know what this is. And they go through a couple of tests, like, look at those books over there, what do you see? Go back to the memory of the sled, what do you see? And we realize for the first time that Jonas is seeing the color red. And the inference there that you can make is that the rest of the society sees things in black and white. They don't see any color. Only the giver and Jonas can see colors. And at this point, Jonas can only see the color red, and only some of the time. And at the end of chapter 12, the giver gave him a memory of a rainbow so that he would be familiar with the other colors. Then we rolled into chapter 13, and chapter 13 starts with days went by and weeks. And so we know that the training has been going on for a little while. And we get this bad memory in chapter 13 of Jonas has to witness this elephant being poached, and it's really sad and it's kind of awful. And in that memory, Jonas says, he gets a whole other understanding of the color red and what it could be, because he doesn't think of red as blood until that memory. There is one other thing that happens a couple times in chapter 13 that's worth noting. He feels suddenly like he needs to share some of the experience that he's having, and he tries to send the color red to Asher, and it doesn't work. And he also tries to send the picture of the elephant, like the happy alive elephant, to Lily, and it doesn't work. And so we kind of get the sense that he shouldn't be doing this, but he does it anyway. And so we're going to pick up right here in chapter 13. Giver, Jonas asked once as they were preparing for the day's work, don't you have a spouse? Aren't you allowed to apply for one? Although he was exempt from the rules against rudeness, he was aware that this was a rude question. But the giver had encouraged all of his questions, and not seeming to be embarrassed or offended by even the most personal. The giver chuckled. No, there are no rules against it. I did have a spouse. You are forgetting how old I am, Jonas. My former spouse lives now with the childless adults. Oh, of course. Jonas had forgotten the giver's obvious age. When adults of the community became older, their lives became different. They were no longer needed to create family units. Jonas's own parents, when he and Lily were grown, would go and live with the childless adults. You'll be able to apply for a spouse, Jonas, if you want to. I'll warn you, though, that it will be difficult. Your living arrangements will have to be different from those of most family units because the books are forbidden to citizens. You and I are the only ones with the access to books. Jonas glanced around at the astonishing array of volumes. From time to time now he could see their colors. With their hours together and his and the giver's time consumed by conversation, let me back up. With their hours together, his and the giver's, consumed by conversation and by the transmission of memories, Jonas had not yet opened any of the books. But he read the titles here and there, and he knew they contained all of the knowledge of the centuries, and that one day they would belong to him. So if I have a spouse, and maybe children, I'll have to hide the books from them? The giver nodded. I wasn't permitted to share the books with my spouse. That is correct. And there are other difficulties too, you remember. The rule that says that the new receiver can't talk about his training? Jonas nodded. Of course, he remembered. It had turned out by far to be the most frustrating of the rules that he had to obey. When you become the official receiver, when you are finished here, you will be given a whole new set of rules, and those are the rules that I obey. And it won't surprise you that I am forbidden to talk about my work to anyone except the new receiver. That's you, of course. So there will be a whole part of your life that you won't be able to share with your family. And it's hard, Jonas. It was hard for me. You do understand, don't you, that this is my life, the memories? Jonas nodded again, but he was puzzled. Didn't life consist of the things you did each day? Wasn't there really anything else? I've seen you taking walks, he said. The giver sighed. I walk, I eat at mealtime, and when I'm called by the committee of elders, I appear before them to give them counsel and advice. Do you advise them often? Jonas was a little frightened at the thought that one day he would be the one to advise the ruling body. But the giver said, no, rarely, only when they are faced with something that they have not experienced before. Then they call upon me to use the memories and advise them, but it very seldom happens. Sometimes I wish they would ask for my wisdom more often. There are so many things that I could tell them, things that I wish they would change. But they don't want change. Life is so orderly, so predictable, so painless. That's what they've chosen. I don't know why they even need a receiver then, if they never call upon him, Jonas commented. They need me, and you, the giver said, but didn't explain. They were reminded of that 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago? Jonas asked. Oh, I know. You tried to train a successor, and it failed. Why? Why did that remind them? The giver smiled grimly. When the new receiver failed, the memories that she had and those that she had received were released. They did not come back to me. They went... He paused and seemed to be struggling with the concept. I don't know exactly. They went to the place where the memories once existed before the receivers were created. Someplace out there. He gestured vaguely with his arm. And then people had access to them. And apparently, that's the way it was once. Everyone had access to the memories. It was chaos, he said. They really suffered for a while. Finally, it subsided as the memories were assimilated, but it certainly made them aware of why they need a receiver to contain all that pain and knowledge. But you have to suffer like that all the time, Jonas pointed out. The giver nodded. And you will. It's my life, and it will be yours. Jonas thought about it, about what it would be like for him. Along with walking and eating, he looked around at the walls of books. Reading, that's it? The giver shook his head. Those are simply the things I do. My life is here. In this room? The giver shook his head. He put his hands to his own face, to his chest. No, here, in my being, where the memories are. My instructions in science and technology have taught us about how the brain works, Jonas told him eagerly. It is full of electrical impulses. It's like a computer. If you stimulate one part of the brain with an electrode... He stopped talking. He could see an odd look on the giver's face. They know nothing, the giver said bitterly. Jonas was shocked. Since the first day in the annex room, they had together disregarded the rules about rudeness, and Jonas felt comfortable with that now. But this was different and far beyond rude. This was a terrible accusation. What if someone had heard? He glanced quickly at the wall speaker, terrified that the committee might be listening, as they could any time. But as always, during their sessions together, the switch was turned to off. Nothing? Jonas whispered nervously. But my instructors. The giver flicked his hand as if brushing something aside. Oh, your instructors are trained well. They know their scientific facts. Everyone is well trained for his job. It's just that, without the memories, it's all meaningless. They gave that burden to me, and the previous receiver, and the one before him, and back and back and back, Jonas said, knowing the phrase that always came. And the giver smiled, though his smile was oddly harsh. That's right, and next it will be you. A great honor. Yes, sir, they told me at the ceremony, the very highest honor. Now there's a little bit of a time gap. Some afternoons, the giver sent him away without training. Jonas knew on these days when he arrived to find the giver hunched over, rocking his body slightly back and forth, his face pale, that he would be sent away. Go, the giver would tell him tensely. I'm in pain today. Come back tomorrow. On those days, worried and disappointed, Jonas would walk alone beside the river. The paths were empty of people except for the few delivery crews and landscape workers here and there. Small children were at the child care center after school, and the older ones were busy with volunteer hours of training. By himself, he tested his developing memory. He watched the landscape for glimpses of the green that he knew was embedded in the shrubbery. Then, when it came flickering into his consciousness, he focused upon it, keeping it there and darkening it, holding it in his vision as long as possible, until his head hurt, and then he would let it fade away. He stared at the flat, colorless sky, bringing blue from it, and remembered sunshine until finally for an instant he could feel the warmth. He stood at the foot of the bridge that spanned the river, the bridge that citizens were allowed to cross only on official business. Jonason had crossed it on school trips, visiting the outlying communities, and he knew that the land beyond the bridge was much the same, flat and well ordered, with fields for agriculture. The other communities he had seen on visits were essentially the same as his own. The only differences were slightly altered styles of dwellings and slightly different schedules in school. He wondered what lay in the far distance, where he had never gone. The land didn't end beyond those nearby communities. There were hills, or were there hills elsewhere? Were there vast, wind-torn areas like the place that he had seen in the memory, the place where the elephant had died? More time passes now. Giver, he asked one afternoon, following a day when he had been sent away, what causes you pain? When the giver was silent, Jonas continued, the chief elder told me at the beginning that receiving of memory caused terrible pain, and you described for me the failure that the last new receiver that the failure of the last new receiver released painful memories to the community. But I haven't suffered, Giver, not really. Jonas smiled. Oh, I remember the sunburn you gave me on that first day, but that wasn't so terrible. What is it that makes you suffer so much? If you gave some of it to me, maybe your pain would be less. The giver nodded. Lie down, he said. It's time, I suppose. I can't shield you forever. You'll have to take it all on eventually. Let me think. He went on. When Jonas was on the bed, he went on, and when Jonas was on the bed waiting, he was a little fearful. All right, the giver said after a moment. I've decided. We'll start with something familiar. Let's go again to the hill in the sled. And he placed his hands on Jonas's back. So they're going to revisit the memory, the very first one that Jonas got of being on a sled and going down a hill. You should have had a couple of questions to answer so far. We're going to continue now with chapter 14, and it picks up right where 13 left off. This is going back to the memory of a sled up on a hill. It was much the same, this memory, though the hill seemed to be different, a steeper one, and the snow was not falling as thickly as it had before. It was colder also, Jonas perceived. He could see, as he sat waiting at the top of the hill, the snow beneath the sled was not thick and soft as it had been before, but hard and coated with a bluish ice. The sled moved forward, and Jonas grinned with delight, looking forward to the breathtaking slide through the invigorating air. But the runners this time couldn't slice through the frozen expanse, as they had on the other snow-cushioned hill. Instead, they skittered sideways, and the sled gathered speed, and Jonas pulled the rope, trying to steer. But the steepness and the speed took control from his hands, and he was no longer enjoying the feeling of freedom, but instead was terrified, and at the mercy of the wild acceleration downward over the white ice. Sideways spinning, the sled hit a bump in the hill, and Jonas was jarred loose and thrown violently into the air. He fell with his leg twisted under him, and he could hear the crack of bone. His face scraped along the jagged edge of ice, and when he came at last to a stop, he lay shocked and still, feeling nothing at first but fear. And then the first wave of pain. He gasped. It was as if a hatchet lay lodged in his leg, slicing through each nerve with a hot blade. In his agony, he perceived the word fire, and felt flames licking at the torn bone and flesh where he tried to move and could not, and the pain grew, and he screamed, but there was no answer. Okay, it says he feels fire. Is his leg really on fire? No, his leg is not really on fire. He just, in this memory, his leg is really badly broken, and it's burning so bad that he feels like he's on fire. He screamed. There was no answer. Sobbing, he turned his head and vomited into the frozen snow. Blood dripped from his face into the vomit. No, he cried. The sound disappeared into the empty landscape, into the wind. Then suddenly he was in the annex room again, writhing on the bed, his face wet with tears. Able to move now, he rocked his own body back and forth, breathing deeply to release the remembered pain. He sat and looked down at his own leg, where it lay straight on the bed, unbroken. The brutal slice of pain was gone, but the leg ached horribly. And still, his leg ached horribly still, and his face felt raw. May I have relief of pain, please, he begged. It was always provided in his everyday life, for bruises and wounds, or a smashed finger, or a stomachache, or a skinned knee, or a fall from a bike. There was always a daub of anesthetic ointment, or a pill, or in severe instances an injection that brought complete and instantaneous deliverance. But the giver said no, and looked away. Limping, Jonas walked home, pushing his bicycle that evening. The sunburn pain had been so small in comparison, and had not stayed with him, but this ache lingered. It was not unendurable, as the pain on the hill had been. Jonas tried to be brave. He remembered that the chief elder had said he was brave. Is something wrong, Jonas? His father asked at the evening meal. You're so quiet tonight. Aren't you feeling well? Would you like some medication? But Jonas remembered the rules. No medication for anything having to do with his training, and no discussion of his training. At the time for sharing of feelings, he simply said that he felt tired, and that his school lessons had been unusually demanding that day, and he went to his sleeping room early, and from behind the closed door he could hear his parents and sister laughing as they gave Gabriel his evening bath. They have never known pain, he thought, and the realization made him feel desperately lonely. He rubbed his throbbing leg. He eventually slept again, and again he dreamed of the anguish and isolation on the forsaken hill. So the memory is over, but having experienced that memory, Jonas is still suffering. So let's recap what happened in this bad memory that Jonas just got. The daily training continued, and now it always included pain. The agony of the fractured leg seemed no more than a mild discomfort as the giver led Jonas firmly, little by little, into the deep and terrible suffering of the past. Each time in his kindness the giver ended the afternoon with a color-filled memory of pleasure, a brisk sail on a blue-green lake, a meadow dotted with flowers, an orange sunset behind the mountains. But it was not enough to assuage the pain that Jonas was beginning now to know. Why? Jonas asked him after he'd received a torturous memory in which he had been neglected and unfed. The hunger had caused excruciating spasms in his empty, distended stomach. He lay on the bed aching. Why? Why do you and I have to hold these memories? It gives us wisdom, the giver replied. Without wisdom I could not be called upon. Without wisdom I could not fulfill my function of advising the committee of elders when called upon. But what wisdom do you get from hunger? Jonas groaned. His stomach still hurt, though the memory had ended. Some years ago, the giver told him, before your birth, a lot of citizens petitioned the committee of elders. They wanted to increase the rate of births. They wanted each birth mother to be assigned 4 births instead of 3, so that the population would increase and there would be more laborers available. Jonas nodded, listening. It made sense. The idea was that certain family units could accommodate an additional child. Jonas nodded. Mine could, he pointed out. We have Gabriel this year, and it's fun having a 3rd child. The committee of elders sought my advice, the giver said. It made sense to them too, but it was a new idea, so they came to me for wisdom. And you used your memories? The giver said yes, and the strongest memory that came was hunger. It came from many generations back, centuries back. The population had gotten so big that hunger was everywhere, excruciating hunger and starvation, and that was followed by warfare. Warfare. It was a concept that Jonas did not know, but hunger was familiar to him now. Unconsciously, he rubbed his own abdomen, recalling the pain of his unfulfilled needs. So you described that to them? They didn't want to hear about the pain. They just came to seek advice. I simply advised them against increasing the population. But you said that was before my birth. They hardly ever come to you for advice. Only when what was it you said? When they have a problem they've never faced before? When did it happen last? Do you remember the day when the plane flew over the community? Yes, I was scared, said Jonas. So were they, and they prepared to shoot it down. But they sought my advice, and I told them to wait. But how did you know? How did you know the pilot was lost? I didn't. I used my wisdom from the memories. I knew that there had been times in the past, terrible times, when people had destroyed others in haste, in fear, and had brought about their own destruction. Jonas realized something. That means, he said slowly, that you have memories of destruction, and you will have to give them to me too, because I have to get the wisdom. The giver nodded. But it will hurt, Jonas said, and it wasn't a question. It will hurt terribly, the giver agreed. But why can't everyone have the memories? I think it would seem a little bit easier if the memories were shared. You and I wouldn't have to bear so much by ourselves if everybody took a part. And the giver sighed. You're right, he said, but then everyone would be burdened and pained, and they don't want that. That's the real reason the receiver is so vital to them and so honored. They selected me, and you, to lift that burden from themselves. When did they decide? Jonas asked angrily. It isn't fair. Let's change it. How do you suppose we do that? I've never been able to think of a way, and I'm supposed to be the one with all the wisdom. But there are 2 of us now, Jonas said eagerly. Together we can think of something. And the giver watched him with a wry smile. Why can't we apply for a change of rules? Jonas suggested, and the giver laughed, and then Jonas, too, chuckled reluctantly. The decision was made long before my time, or yours, the giver said. and before the previous receiver, and he waited. Back and back and back, Jonas repeated the familiar phrase. Sometimes it had seemed humorous to him. Sometimes it had seemed meaningful and important. Now it was ominous. It meant, he knew, that nothing could be changed. Time passes again. The new child Gabriel was growing and successfully passed the tests of maturity that the nurturers gave each month. He could sit now alone and could reach for and grasp small play objects. He had 6 teeth. During the daytime hours, Father reported he was cheerful and seemed of normal intelligence, but he remained fretful at nighttime, whimpering often, needing frequent attention. After all this time I've put in with him, Father said one evening, after Gabriel had been bathed and was lying for the moment hugging his hippo placidly in the small crib that had replaced the basket. I hope that they're not going to decide to release him. Maybe it would be for the best, Mother suggested. I don't know. I know you don't mind getting up with him at night, but that lack of sleep is awfully hard for me. If they release Gabriel, can we get another new child as a visitor? Asked Lily. She was kneeling beside the crib, making funny faces at the little one who was smiling back at her. Jonas's mother rolled her eyes. No, Father said, smiling, and he ruffled Lily's hair. It is very rare, anyway, that a new child's status is uncertain as Gabriel's. It probably won't happen again for a very long time. Anyway, he sighed, they won't make any decision for a while. Right now, we are preparing for the release that we'll probably have to make very soon. There's a birth mother who's expecting twin males next month. Oh, dear, Mother said, shaking her head. If they're identical, I hope you're not the one assigned. I am. I'm the next one on the list. I'll have to select the one to be nurtured and the one to be released. It usually is not hard, though. Usually it's just a matter of birth weight. We release the smaller of the two. Jonas, listening, thought suddenly about the bridge and how, standing there, he had wondered what lay elsewhere. Was there someone there waiting who would receive the tiny twin? Would it grow up elsewhere, not knowing ever that in this community lived a being who looked exactly the same? For a moment he felt a tiny fluttering of hope, the way that he knew was quite foolish. He hoped that it would be Larissa waiting. Larissa, the old woman that he had bathed. He remembered her sparkling eyes and her soft voice and her low chuckle. Fiona had told him recently that Larissa had been released at a wonderful ceremony. But he knew the old were not given children to raise. Larissa's life elsewhere would be quiet and serene and befit the old. She would not welcome the responsibility of nurturing a new child who needed feeding and care and would likely cry at night. Mother, Father, Jonas said, the idea coming into him unexpectedly. Why don't we put Gabriel's crib in my room tonight? I know how to feed him and comfort him, and it would let you and Father get some sleep. Father looked doubtful. You sleep so soundly, Jonas. What if his restlessness didn't wake you? It was Lily who answered. If no one goes to tend to Gabriel, she pointed out, he gets very, very loud. He'll wake all of us if Jonas sleeps through it. Father laughed. You're right, Lily Billy. All right, Jonas, let's try it. Just for tonight. I'll take the night off, and we'll let Mother get some sleep, too. Gabriel slept soundly for the earliest part of the night. Jonas in his bed lay awake for a while, and from time to time he raised himself on an elbow and looked over at the crib. The new child was on his stomach, his arms relaxed beside his head, his eyes closed, his breathing regular and undisturbed. Finally, Jonas slept too. Then, as the middle hours of the night approached, the noise of Gabe's restlessness woke Jonas. The new child was turning under his cover, flailing his arms and beginning to whimper. Jonas rose and went to him, gently patting Gabe's back. Sometimes that was all it took to lull him back to sleep, but the new child still squirmed fretfully under his hand. Still patting rhythmically, Jonas began to remember the wonderful sail that the giver had given him not long before, a bright breezy day on a clear turquoise lake, and above him the white sail of the boat billowing as he moved along in the brisk wind. He was not aware of giving the memory, but suddenly he realized that it was becoming dimmer, and it was sliding through his hand and into the being of the new child. Gabriel became quiet. Startled, Jonas pulled his hand back, and what was left of the memory, with a burst of will. He removed his hand from the little back and stood quietly beside the crib. To himself, he called the memory of the sail forward again. It was still there, but the sky was less blue, and the gentle motion of the water slower. and the water of the lake more murky and clouded. He kept it for a while, soothing his own nervousness at what had occurred, and then he let it go and returned to his bed. Once more, toward dawn, the new child woke and cried out. Again Jonas went to him. This time he quite deliberately placed his hand firmly on Gabriel's back and released the rest of the calming day at the lake. And again Gabriel slept. But now Jonas lay awake thinking. He no longer had any more than a wisp of that memory, and he felt a small lack where it had been. He could ask the giver for another sail, he knew. A sail perhaps on the ocean next time, for Jonas had a memory of an ocean now, and knew what it was like, and knew what it was. He knew that there were sailboats there too, in the memories yet to be required. He wondered, though, if he should confess to the giver that he had given a memory away. He was not yet qualified to be a giver himself, nor had Gabriel been selected to be a receiver. That he had this power frightened him, and he decided not to tell. So we have to pause here and think about what could make someone able to receive. We know that Asher cannot receive memories, he tried. We know that Lily cannot receive memories, he tried. But now, without even trying, he accidentally lets a memory slip into Gabe. Do you remember back to the beginning what Gabe and Jonas have in common? There is a physical trait that they both share. What is it? If you didn't remember, it's their pale eyes. Gabe has pale eyes and Jonas has pale eyes. And if you think about it, the giver also has pale eyes. So these pale eyes indicate that you have the capacity to receive memories. And it happens so easily that Jonas doesn't even do it on purpose in this particular chapter. All right, that is the end of 14. That is all we are reading today. Enjoy your weekend and make sure that you have filled out all the questions on Miss Edpuzzle. Have a great weekend. We will see you Monday, and we will do questions after chapter 15, our next day's reading.